All right, so you know how it is. You want to stay informed. You want to know what's going on out there. You want to be in the loop.
Hmm.
But you don't want to feel overwhelmed, right?
Exactly. It's about depth over just sheer volume.
Yeah. So today, we're diving into something pretty fascinating, something that's really reshaping the way we all get our information, the media landscape as we know it.
A fundamental shift, you could say.
Big time. We're talking about the rise of independent thinkers. These are the voices that are breaking through the traditional media noise, the voices that are really starting to influence how a lot of us see the world.
It's an interesting phenomenon.
It really is. And we've got this article from March 2025 that lays it all out, this whole rise of these unfiltered perspectives and how they're gaining serious traction. So what we want to do today is kind of unpack why this is happening, what it means for how we get our information, what it means for all of us.
Yeah. It's worth thinking about where we were, where things stood before this shift started happening. I mean, you have to remember how dominant traditional media organizations used to be. For decades, they essentially had a monopoly on shaping news and analysis. They were the gatekeepers.
Right. They were the ones we all turned to, the ones who we thought had the definitive account. But what this article is really highlighting is a pretty crucial change. There's this growing lack of faith in those established institutions, this perception of bias, of corporate influence behind the stories that we're getting.
And that decline in trust, it makes sense that it would lead to a pretty natural consequence, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
If you feel like you're not getting the full story or an objective take from those traditional sources, where do you turn? You're going to start looking for alternatives, other voices.
Exactly. And the article points out that that's exactly what audiences are doing. More and more, they're seeking out different perspectives. They're looking for analyses that challenge the mainstream narrative.
And it's not just anecdotal. It's not just a feeling. I mean, the article cites recent studies that show a real drop in trust for major news networks. People are concerned about who's controlling the editorial decisions, about political agendas seeping into the coverage.
Yeah. There's a sense that news has become too sensationalized, too focused on grabbing attention rather than informing.
Exactly. And all of that has created an opening that these independent voices have stepped into. The article emphasizes the rise of platforms like podcasts, YouTube channels, social media spaces. These are the new hubs for alternative discussions.
Right. And what's really interesting is that these platforms offer something that you rarely find in traditional news. The ability to have these long-form conversations that really delve into complex issues.
Exactly. They can really breathe, explore different facets of an issue without being constrained by the limitations of a broadcast format.
Without constant commercial interruption.
Or network censorship, for that matter.
That freedom to speak openly, without that corporate oversight, that seems to be a big part of the appeal of these independent voices. There's this sense of authenticity that's lacking in a lot of traditional media.
Yeah. It feels much less filtered, more raw and genuine.
And the article uses Joe Rogan as a prime example. And it's hard to argue with his impact. I mean, his podcast platform is huge. It's built on these long, often unscripted conversations with just this wild range of guests. You've got scientists on there, comedians, military experts, people who are into UAPs. It's a real melting pot of perspectives.
It's fascinating, isn't it? You get these unexpected combinations of people who might not normally interact in a public forum.
Exactly. And what's really striking about Rogan's approach is that he encourages open debate, even on topics where there's strong disagreement.
He's not afraid to have guests on who hold opposing viewpoints.
Right. And that feels very different from the more tightly controlled discussions that you might see on a cable news network.
It's a much more free-flowing exchange, more organic.
Yeah. And then you've got someone like Darryl Cooper. He does this Martyr Made podcast where he goes on these really deep dives into historical events.
Yeah. And what's interesting about Cooper's approach is that he often presents alternative interpretations of history. He challenges those common narratives that we all tend to accept as truth.
Right. He's encouraging people to really think critically about the stories that we've been told.
Exactly. To question the accepted wisdom.
And then there's Jacques Vallée, who's a venture capitalist, but he's also been deeply involved in the study of UAPs. He's using his platform to discuss these subjects that, for a long time, were kind of dismissed by mainstream media.
Yeah. UAPs, UFOs, these were topics that were often considered fringe, not worthy of serious discussion. But thanks in part to people like Vallée, they're starting to enter the mainstream conversation.
Absolutely. And his work is a good example of how these independent platforms can lend legitimacy to topics that traditional media might have considered too out there.
They can open up new avenues of inquiry, challenge those ingrained assumptions.
And all of this ties back to the rising popularity of long-form content, which the article really emphasizes. It's like we're moving away from those quick, soundbite-driven news updates.
Absolutely. We're craving more depth, more nuance.
And platforms like YouTube and Spotify have really made that possible. Now, you can find discussions that go on for hours, allowing for this much more thorough exploration of ideas.
Right. You can really get into the weeds, so to speak.
Yeah. And for someone who really wants to understand a topic without being bombarded by these fragmented bits of information, that long-form approach is so valuable. It provides the context, the depth that you need to really grasp these complex issues.
It's about taking the time to really delve into something to understand it fully.
Right. And it also connects to this craving for authenticity that the article talks about. Consumers today, they can tell when they're being fed a particular spin, when something doesn't feel genuine.
They're much more discerning.
Yeah. And they're drawn to voices that aren't just parroting the same talking points that you hear everywhere else. They're looking for people who are willing to question the status quo, to offer different perspectives.
Even if those perspectives are controversial.
Exactly. And that hunger for real conversation, for voices that aren't afraid to deviate from the mainstream narrative, that's driving the success of these independent podcasts and alternative media outlets, it's tapping into a need for something that feels less manufactured, more real.
It's a reaction against the polished, often predictable nature of traditional media.
Right. But it's not all smooth sailing for these independent voices, is it?
Yeah.
The article also talks about the pushback they face, the challenges that they encounter, even with their large followings.
Yeah. They're not immune to criticism, and they have to navigate these complex content moderation policies on the big platforms, the YouTubes, the Twitters, the Facebooks of the world.
Right. These policies are basically the rules that those platforms have about what kind of content is allowed, how it's treated, and they can have a real impact on these independent creators.
Absolutely. They can lead to demonetization, which means they lose advertising revenue, or even the removal of content that's deemed controversial.
And this is where things get really interesting because there are strong opinions on both sides of this issue. Critics of these policies argue that they amount to censorship, that they're stifling free expression.
Right. They feel like these platforms are essentially silencing dissenting voices.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then you have people who support these policies who argue that they're absolutely necessary to combat misinformation, to prevent the spread of harmful content.
They see it as a matter of protecting the public from potentially dangerous ideas.
Right. So it's this really tough balancing act, trying to uphold the principle of free speech while also ensuring a level of responsibility in the information that's being shared.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Yeah. And the article touches on cases where creators have been completely deplatformed, where they've essentially been kicked off these mainstream platforms.
Right. And when that happens, they often have to look for alternative outlets.
Like Rumble, Substack. Some even start exploring these decentralized media options.
These systems that aren't controlled by a single company, systems that aim to give more power to users.
Exactly. So there's this real tension between independent media and the control that these large corporate platforms have. It's a battle over digital free speech, over who gets to shape the information landscape in this digital age.
It's a conflict that's likely to continue for the foreseeable future.
So looking ahead, what does all of this mean for the future of media, for public discourse? The article suggests that this rise of independent voices, it's not just a fad, it's likely to have a lasting impact.
Yeah. I think it's safe to say that the media landscape is undergoing a fundamental shift.
It feels like we're heading towards a more decentralized media environment, one where these independent platforms play a much bigger role in shaping how we understand the world around us.
Absolutely. It's about empowering individuals to take control of their own narratives, to connect directly with their audiences.
Right. And that could take many forms. We'll probably see the continued growth of podcasts, independent news websites, but we might also see new models emerge, maybe even blockchain-based solutions that give even more control to creators and consumers.
It's an exciting time to be following these developments.
It really is. It feels like this movement towards more transparent, less restricted discussions, it's not going away. It's a fundamental change in how we consume and share information.
I think that's a great point. It's a shift in the very fabric of our media ecosystem.
Yeah. And this article that we've been discussing, it does a great job of outlining how that shift is playing out, the forces that are driving it. It's about that declining trust in traditional media, the desire for unfiltered, in-depth conversations.
And the figures that we've talked about, Joe Rogan, Darryl Cooper, Jacques Vallée, they're really at the forefront of this movement.
Right. They exemplify this hunger for alternative perspectives, for a deeper dive into topics that might not get the same level of attention in mainstream media.
And while this shift presents certain challenges, it also opens up some incredible opportunities. Opportunities for a more diverse, a more open exchange of ideas.
And so crucial, isn't it? A truly open exchange of ideas where different perspectives can be shared and debated. That's essential for a healthy public discourse.
Couldn't agree more. It's the lifeblood of a vibrant democracy.
So as you navigate the world of information, consider the implications of this shift. How does it affect the way you evaluate information, the sources that you choose to trust? What role do these independent voices play in your own understanding of the world? These are questions worth thinking about.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. It's about becoming more conscious, more aware of the forces that shape our understanding of the world. It's about taking ownership of our own information journey.